He thought his mate was dead, until he saw her serving at the royal feast. Adebayo's hands were shaking when they handed him the paper. It was a single printed page, the kind that comes from a government office, with a seal at the top and too many words arranged beneath it. His supervisor had placed it on his desk without comment, as though the document could explain itself. And in a way it did. His name was on it, the date of the state banquet was on it, the venue in Accra was on it. But none of that was why his hands were shaking. His hands were shaking because 3 years ago, on a Thursday afternoon in October, he had received a different kind of paper. That one had a name on it too, a name he had not spoken out loud since the funeral. Amara Diallo. He set the banquet invitation face down on his desk and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Adebayo Ose had grown up in Kumasi in a house where noise was constant and space was tight. He was the third of 4 children, the quiet one, the one who sat in the hallway reading while his siblings argued about football or the television or whose turn it was to wash the dishes. He was not the kind of boy who stood out in a crowd. He never won prizes, or dominated conversations, or walked into rooms in a way that made people notice. Teachers remembered him as dependable. Neighbors remembered him as polite. He blended into rooms the way furniture does, noticed only in absence, taken for granted in presence. He was the kind of person who noticed other things instead, the exact shade the sky turned before rain, a particular gray that was different from ordinary cloud gray, heavier and closer and specific to the moment before water came. The way his mother's voice dropped half a note when she was worried and did not want anyone to know. The specific sound the old iron gate at the back of their yard made when his father came home late, a low scrape, and then a small clang that was different from the sound it made at any other hour, as though even the gate understood the significance of lateness. He noticed Amara on the first day of secondary school because she was the only student who arrived early and chose the back row. Everyone else had moved toward the front seats, performing visible eagerness for whatever was about to begin. She had a notebook open and a pen already moving when the other students filed in. She was not performing anything. She was simply working. When 40 new students arranged themselves around her, noisy, excited, reorganizing themselves into the first formations of a new social world, she did not look up once. Not for any of it. He sat 2 seats from her. He watched her from the side of his eye for the entire first period and told himself it was only because she was unusual, which was true, and had nothing to do with anything else, which was less true. He did not know her name. He did not know what she was writing in the notebook. He knew nothing about her at all, and she was the most present person in the room. He did not speak to her for 3 weeks, not because she frightened him, though she might have if he had let it come to that. He simply could not find something worth saying that was not inadequate, and inadequate was not what he wanted to be in front of someone who wrote in notebooks before the lesson began. He waited. On the 22nd day he told her, carefully, that her answer on the history examination had been more accurate than the teacher's marking scheme. He had checked both against the textbook. She looked at him with an expression of someone who had been waiting for someone to eventually say something accurate, and she said, "I know." Then she added, "My name is Amara," and went back to her notebook. They became friends the way some friendships form, not in a single moment but in accumulated ones, small daily exchanges that kept adding up until the friendship was simply enormous, and neither of them could find the point where it had started. She was sharp and direct, and occasionally exhausting in the specific way that very precise people are exhausting when they will not soften the truth to make it easier to receive. She remembered everything and reminded him of things he had chosen to let go. She was the one who woke him for examinations when his alarm failed, who stood outside his door at 6 in the morning and knocked with the steady patience of someone who had already calculated that he could not afford to miss this particular thing. She was the one who told him, plainly and without cushioning, when he was being self-pitying about something that deserved less attention than he was giving it. And she was the one who filled out half of his university application form herself, when he had given up on it, left it on his desk with the remaining sections highlighted, and added a note that said only, "Finish it." She was also the one who called him, laughing, at 11 o'clock at night, to tell him he had passed the entrance examination, because she had somehow found out before the official results reached him. He never quite understood how she always found things out first. She had a way of asking questions that assumed the person she was asking would answer, and people answered her, and she made good use of what she learned. They studied at Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, he in public administration, she in economics. They lived on the same campus for 4 years and spent more time in each other's orbit than in anyone else's. People consistently assumed they were a couple. They were not. People found this difficult to accept, which was understandable, but also consistently irritating to both of them. What they were was harder to categorize than a couple, and easier to simply be, solid and certain and entirely taken for granted, the way you take for granted anything that has always been there and seems like it will always be there. After graduation, she moved to Accra for work, a private company that needed someone with her combination of economic analysis and the ability to explain economic conclusions to people who had not studied economics, which she could do without condescension, and that was a skill not everyone with her qualifications had. He stayed in Kumasi and joined the civil service. They spoke 3 or 4 times a week on the phone. She sent him long voice notes while commuting, narrating the traffic, the office politics, the specific frustrations of working in a city that never quite moved at the pace she wanted. He sent shorter ones and she complained about the brevity with consistent enthusiasm, every single time, as though she had not been complaining about the same thing for years. That was how it was between them. That was what they were to each other. And he had come to think of it the way you think of the kitchen in your own home, not consciously, but as simply part of the structure, something that has never given you cause to imagine its absence. And then October came. The accident happened on a highway he had driven himself many times. A commercial bus heading from Accra to Kumasi lost control on a downhill bend late on a Thursday afternoon and went into the ravine below the road. 15 people were on board. The news reached Kumasi by evening. It reached Adebayo by phone call from Amara's cousin, a woman named Grace, who spoke with a flatness so careful and so deliberate that he understood the weight of what had happened before she finished her first sentence. That kind of voice does not need words to carry its meaning. The meaning precedes the words. He did not believe it at first. This is the thing to understand about loss like this, about grief that arrives without any preparation. The mind does not accept it immediately. It is not built to. He called Amara's phone. It rang and went to her recorded message, her actual voice, ordinary and unhurried, telling him she was unavailable. He thought, she will call back. He called again at midnight, again at 3 in the morning. He sat on the edge of his bed in his dark flat and called 6 more times between then and dawn, and each time the phone rang and her recorded voice answered, and he was briefly, irrationally steadied by the sound of it. The casualty list was released 2 days later, a typed document that moved through official channels, and then through family groups, and then through everyone waiting. Her name was on it. He read it 4 times. He read it a 5th time because he felt certain he had misread it. He had not. The funeral was held on a Saturday, 11 days after the accident. Her family received visitors with the particular quiet of a household where the worst thing has already happened and there is nothing left to prepare for. Her mother held his hand for a long time without speaking. He stood at the graveside in a borrowed jacket and felt the sky press down on him with a weight that had nothing to do with weather. He had written something to say. He said none of it. He stood and looked at the earth and thought about a girl who had filled in the blank sections of a form and told him to finish it, and he could not find a sentence anywhere in himself that was large enough to hold what she had been. So he stood in silence and let the morning do what it did. The weeks after were functional and gray. He went to work. He came home. He ate when he remembered to eat. His mother visited twice and cleaned his flat without asking permission, which was her specific language for worry. He told her he was fine. She used the look she had always used when she knew he was not telling the truth and did not press him on it. The grief became carryable over time. This is the honest thing about loss. It does not shrink. You grow to hold it. He learned to not reach for his phone on evenings when she would have called. He started returning messages from friends. He deleted her contact from his phone on a quiet Wednesday in January, and then sat on the kitchen floor for 20 minutes because pressing a button had felt like something irreversible being stamped into place. He kept the voice notes. He did not listen to them. He kept them without examining why. 3 years moved through him. His department gave him more responsibility. He moved to a larger flat. He read more. He made new friends, good ones, people who knew him only as the man he was now, and not as the man who had sat on a kitchen floor in January with a phone in his hand. He was not unhappy. He was functional. There is a long populated territory between happiness and unhappiness where most people spend most of their lives, and he had made a home there, and it was a reasonable home. The banquet invitation sat on his desk all morning. His supervisor, Colin Mensah, a round-faced man who wore the same brand of tie every day in different colors as his primary form of self-expression, stopped by at lunch and asked if Adebayo had read the invitation. He said he had. "You should go," Colin said. "Good opportunity." "I do not attend those kinds of events," Adebayo said. "You have never been invited to those kinds of events," Colin replied. "That is not the same statement." This was accurate. Adebayo found it irritating that it was accurate. A colleague named Peter, who sat 2 desks away and had the particular optimism of someone who had not yet been seriously disappointed by anything important, overheard the exchange and offered his opinion immediately and without being asked. The venue was one of the finest government guest houses in Accra. The guest list included names Adebayo had only read on official correspondence. The food, Peter said with great certainty, would be exceptional. "How do you know the food will be exceptional?" Adebayo asked. "Because the government pays for it," Peter said. "It is always exceptional when the government pays." Adebayo looked at the invitation again. He thought about the drive to Accra, the stiff jacket he had worn exactly twice and never felt at ease in, a room full of dignitaries, and the specific pain of small talk with important strangers. He was reaching for reasons to decline, which was something he was very practiced at. Then, without choosing to, he thought about Amara. He thought about a voice note from 4 years ago, her description of a government function she had attended for her company. She had reviewed the food with the seriousness of a professional critic. She had said one minister's tie looked as though it had been cut from a hotel curtain. She had been precise and funny, and he had put the phone down twice because he could not laugh and breathe at the same time. She would have told him to go. She would have required a full report. She would have asked about the food first. He picked up the invitation. "All right," he said. "I will go." He folded it into his jacket pocket. He said nothing more about it. He went back to work and carried the decision quietly for the rest of the afternoon, and something shifted in him that he did not have the language for and did not try to name. 3 weeks later, on a humid Thursday evening, Adebayo drove himself to Accra in his cousin's car. His own vehicle had a cooling problem his mechanic had been promising to fix for 2 months, and had not. The drive took 4 hours with the usual traffic. He arrived at the hotel the ministry had booked for its delegates, a mid-range place in Osu, clean and professional, at just past 8 in the evening. The receptionist handed him his key without making him feel like an inconvenience. He went upstairs, showered, ordered rice from the hotel kitchen, and sat on the edge of the bed and watched the ceiling fan turn for a while. He was not anxious. He was not excited. He was a man in an unfamiliar room, in a familiar city, eating rice, watching a fan, with nowhere to be until the following evening. The banquet was the next night. He had a full day. He spent the morning on foot, moving through the city without a destination, paying attention to things in the way that the city rewarded if you were willing to slow down for it. He walked the beach road and watched the fishing boats come in, the men moving with the efficient calm of people whose bodies have repeated the same work for long enough that the work no longer requires thought, only presence. He ate fried plantain from a roadside stall run by a woman who handed him his change with such unhurried precision that the transaction felt important. He bought a newspaper and sat under a tree in a small park and read it cover to cover, the way he had not done in months, because at home there was always something else claiming priority. He thought about Amara twice during the walk. The first time was when he passed a junction she had described in a voice note, the lopsided traffic light, the man who sold phone accessories from a cart at the corner. The traffic light was still lopsided. He did not look closely enough to see whether the accessories man was still there. The second time was when he saw two young women walking together on the other side of the road, both laughing at something between them with the unguarded ease of people who have known each other long enough to share a private language. He watched them for a moment and then turned in a different direction and kept walking. He returned to the hotel in the afternoon and slept longer than he intended. He woke with a headache from the sun and not enough water, found aspirin at the bottom of his bag after a long search, drank a full glass of water, and stood at the window while the headache cleared. The city was in its late afternoon shift, traffic slowing and thickening, the light going warm, the street below filling with the people who were going home from the places they had been all day. He showered again. He put on the stiff jacket over a pale blue shirt. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror and considered himself for a moment. He looked presentable. This was the most accurate thing he could say about himself in that jacket, and he said it plainly, and then he went downstairs. The government guest house was not what he had expected. He had anticipated formal. He had not anticipated beautiful. The building was colonial in its original structure, but had been updated with genuine elegance. Cream walls, polished wooden floors, tall windows and dark curtains that held the evening light in a way that felt considered rather than accidental. The driveway had low lamps placed at intervals. Staff stood at regular positions with an attention that was neither military nor welcoming, but somewhere precise and professional between the two. It was the kind of place that made a person stand slightly straighter without being told to, which is the signature of a room designed by people who understood exactly what they were building. At the entrance, a young woman with a clipboard checked his name, attached a small laminated card to his lapel, and directed him toward the reception area where pre-dinner drinks were being served. He took a glass of juice. He did not want to drink alcohol in a room where he was expected to make sense, and moved to a corner of the space where the gathering was visible but where he was not immediately required to participate in it. He had always been good at corners. The ability to hold a position at the edge of a room, to watch and listen without drawing attention, to be present without announcing it. This was a skill he had built over a lifetime of being the quiet one, and had never consciously decided to develop, and never consciously stopped developing. He used it now. The room filled with people whose names he knew from government memos, and whose faces he was matching to them in real time. A regional minister whose infrastructure project had been in the news for weeks. A senior judicial official whose rulings he had studied in a training course 2 years ago. A ceremonial government officer whose job appeared, from the outside, to consist primarily of moving through the room at a pace that suggested great importance. Staff from foreign embassies, people from private industry, several people whose function he could not identify and who therefore seemed, paradoxically, the most powerful people present. He was introduced to a man named Gerald from another ministry who had strong, well-organized opinions about pension reform and expressed them with the quiet energy of someone who had been thinking about this for years and was glad to finally have an audience. They talked for 20 minutes, and Adebayo found himself genuinely engaged. He had not expected this. He had expected to spend the evening managing polite boredom at a distance. He was not bored. He met a woman named Patricia from the Foreign Affairs Office who had just returned from a 6-month posting in Brussels and was still processing European winter, which she described not as cold exactly, but as an argument she had not known she was entering. He asked her questions and she answered with the evident relief of someone who had been waiting for a person who was actually listening. He realized with mild surprise, doing all right. At 8 o'clock precisely, staff directed the guests through to the dining hall, a long, high-ceilinged room, a formal table set for nearly 40 people, crystal glasses catching the light from the chandeliers, name cards at each place. He found his card, settled between Gerald and a woman he had not yet met, unfolded his napkin, and thought that Peter had probably been right about the food. The first course arrived, a pale, delicately seasoned soup, served by white uniformed staff moving around the table with practiced quiet. He lifted his spoon. He tasted it. It was, in fact, exceptional. He made a mental note to tell Peter this later, with the tone of someone confirming a hypothesis they had held in reserve. He was on his second spoonful when he heard the soft clink of a water glass being refilled at the far end of the table. He looked up, not because he meant to, because anyone looks toward a small sound in a quiet room. A reflex, purely a reflex. A server was moving along the opposite side of the table. Young woman, white uniform, hair pulled back cleanly. She was leaning slightly forward as she poured, attentive to the glass, her left hand resting at the base of her collarbone in the way a person holds themselves when they are concentrating very carefully on being precise. Adebayo's spoon stopped. He knew that gesture, not as a piece of information he had stored, not as something he could have described to another person 2 minutes earlier. He knew it the way the body knows things the mind has stopped consciously maintaining, the way you know the sound of a specific gate or the smell of a specific room. That position of the hand, left hand, against the collarbone, when she was being exact about something, when she was making certain she did not pour too much, when she was giving a small task the precise amount of attention it deserved. He had seen it in a library, in a lecture hall, on a phone screen during a video call at 11 at night when she was explaining something she thought he was not taking seriously enough. He set his spoon down. The server continued along the table, not looking up, moving with a slight forward lean that was specific, the walk of a person always slightly ahead of herself, always nearly arriving. He watched her from across the table and told himself what he knew to be true, that grief does this, that the mind projects familiar shapes onto strangers, that this was the kind of thing the brain produces when it has been carrying a loss for long enough. He had read this. He trusted the reading. He picked up his spoon. He did not use it. She reached the section of the table diagonal from him. The chandelier light shifted as she leaned forward to check the level of water in the glass she was filling. She tilted her head. The light fell on the left side of her face without shadow. He saw her clearly. His hand caught the edge of his bowl. The bowl shifted. A sound. The man beside him made a startled noise. A staff member appeared with a cloth. Adebayo said, "I am sorry, forgive me," in a voice that sounded ordinary and did not feel it, and he was using his napkin, and he was not looking at the cloth or the bowl or the apologetic face beside his chair. He was looking at the server. She had glanced up at the commotion, the way anyone does when there is a sound and movement in a quiet room, and in the half-second before her gaze returned to the jug in her hand, it landed on Adebayo. She went very still, not the stillness of calm, the kind that looks like calm from the outside, because the person producing it is very disciplined and very frightened at exactly the same time. The crystal jug stayed exactly where it was. The official beside her glanced up. She resumed pouring. Her hand did not shake. Her expression did not change. But something had moved behind her eyes before composure returned. Something that a stranger would have missed entirely, and that Adebayo had not missed and could not have missed. It was not the look of a person who had seen someone she did not know. He sat in his chair and could not feel his hands. Gerald said something to his left. Polite, concerned, something about the spill. Adebayo answered with words that left his mouth correctly without involving any part of his mind that was currently available for language. He was watching the server from the outermost edge of his vision as she continued along the table with complete and frightening professionalism. She did not look at him again. But he had seen it, what her face had done in that half-second. He was certain of it. The dinner continued. Courses arrived and were cleared. Conversation moved in waves. The chandeliers held steady above 40 people, having a very different evening from the one he was having. He sat among them with a beating heart and his untouched soup and the absolute, specific, impossible knowledge that the woman whose name he had read on a casualty list 3 years ago was alive and working 6 meters away from him in a room full of government officials. He excused himself between the second and third courses. He walked to the restroom with the measured calm of a person performing normality. He stood at the basin and looked at himself in the mirror. He ran cold water over his wrists. He breathed carefully. He told his reflection to go back inside and finish the dinner and drive back to the hotel and sleep. His reflection offered no opinion on this plan. He went back inside. He occupied his chair for the remaining courses, which was not quite the same as finishing the dinner, but served the same external purpose. He responded to things people said. He thanked the server who cleared his plate. He held a glass of pineapple juice at the end of the meal and looked at it for a while. The server in the white uniform did not reappear at his section of the table for the remaining courses. When the dinner concluded, and the guests rose, and the room dispersed into handshakes and farewells, Adebayo moved through all of it correctly. He shook Gerald's hand. He told Patricia he hoped she adjusted well. He said the things the evening required. And then he did not walk toward the main exit. He walked toward the corridor he believed, from the layout of the building, led to the service area. His hands were in his pockets. His heart was making a sound he had not heard from it before. At the end of the corridor there was a set of double doors, with a push bar and a small rectangular window at eye level. He stopped at the window and looked through. A service kitchen, stainless steel surfaces, strip lighting, white uniforms everywhere, the organized movement of a catering team at the end of a long event. He scanned the room through the glass with a focus he had not applied to anything in years. He found her, near a trolley, her back to the door, speaking to a colleague. He pushed through the doors. Several people looked up. The room's noise lowered slightly. He was visibly out of place. A man in a formal jacket with a laminated name card on his lapel, standing in the middle of a service kitchen. The woman near the trolley had gone still. She turned around, slowly. Amara Diallo. 3 years after her funeral, standing 3 meters in front of him in a white uniform with a water jug in her hand, looking at him with an expression he could not name. Alive, entirely, completely, impossibly and actually alive. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. She spoke first. "I can explain," she said. Her voice, her actual living voice, not a memory of it, not a recording, went through him like something that had been held back for a very long time finally arriving. "Not here," he said. His voice sounded ordinary. He was impressed by this. She looked around the kitchen, back at him. "Not here," she agreed. They stood outside in the warm Accra night, in the shadow of a low wall beside the service entrance where the car park lights did not reach. The sound of departing guests came from around the corner, engines starting, doors closing, brief voices exchanging final pleasantries before driving away into the ordinary city. Adebayo stood with his hands in his pockets. Amara stood with her arms folded across herself, not defensively but in the way of a person holding herself together while she decides where to begin. She had changed into her own clothes, a simple dark dress, flat shoes. She looked like herself. This kept striking him in waves. In the irrational private moments the brain sometimes generates when grief has lived in it long enough, he had occasionally and inadvertently imagined something like this, a version of this moment, and in all of those versions she had looked different, changed in visible ways, diminished somehow, altered by whatever the years had done. She was none of those things. She was just Amara, standing in the Accra night, which was the most extraordinary and most ordinary thing he had ever seen happen at exactly the same time. "Tell me," he said, "from the beginning." She was quiet for a moment. The car park had gone mostly empty. Somewhere around the corner of the building, a last set of headlights swept the sky as someone turned out of the driveway. Then it was quiet. She began. The bus had left Accra in the early afternoon. She had been in a window seat on the left side, toward the back. The road had been clear for most of the journey. She remembered looking at the trees passing outside and thinking she should call her mother when she arrived in Kumasi. She was thinking about nothing important. She was planning the evening in the simple, comfortable way of a person with ordinary things to do. She remembered nothing after that for a very long time. She woke in a hospital room she did not recognize, in a city she did not recognize. There was a tube in her arm. A nurse was speaking to her, in a voice so gentle and so careful that the quality of the voice alone told her, before the words registered at all, that something serious had happened. The ceiling above her was an unfamiliar shade of white. The window showed a skyline she did not know. She had been pulled from the wreck by a driver who had been traveling in the opposite direction on the road and had seen the bus go over the embankment. He had stopped his vehicle and gone down the slope and found her. She was told this by the nurse, then by a doctor, then by a second doctor. She was told it several times in those first days, because each time they told her, she forgot, and then they told her again. The driver's name was not known. He had not stayed. The injuries were significant. 2 broken ribs, a fractured left arm, a head injury serious enough that for the first several weeks, she could not hold a coherent thought for more than a few minutes before it slipped away from her. She could not remember her own name. She wants to be precise about this, she told Adebayo, because people imagine it as something more dramatic than it was. It was not a clean blank, not a dramatic slate wiping. It was fog. She moved from moment to moment through a thick, continuous fog. She knew how to speak. She knew what objects were. She knew what a family was, and understood that she had one, and that they would be looking for her. But when she reached for the specific things, her name, her mother's face, the street she had grown up on, the city she lived in, the phone number she needed to dial, they moved away from her before she could hold them. Each time she tried to reach them, they scattered. The doctors told her this was a known consequence of the type of head injury she had sustained. They were matter-of-fact about it in the way that doctors are when they have seen something before and understand its arc even if the person experiencing it cannot. They told her to be patient. They said the memory would come back. They were correct. It did. It came back in pieces, over weeks. Small things first. The smell of her mother's cooking on a Sunday morning, specific and immediate and overwhelming when it arrived, like opening a door into a room she had believed was sealed. A song she had known since childhood came back one afternoon while she was lying in her hospital bed, every word intact, arriving without effort, as though it had never been gone. The layout of her university campus returned as a detailed spatial map, then larger things, proper names, specific faces. Her own name came back on a Tuesday morning while she was staring at the ceiling, and it came with such force that she sat up and put both hands over her mouth, because the return of it felt like being handed back something she had not known she was capable of losing and had now lost and recovered in the space of 3 weeks of her life. By the time this happened, 6 weeks had passed. She asked the hospital staff to contact her family. This is where the chain of failure started, and explaining it required understanding the specific conditions of those days and weeks. The hospital that had received her had been managing multiple patients from multiple incidents in the same period. There had been a significant road accident, her accident, and 2 other incidents in the surrounding area in the same week. The facility served a large regional population and did not have the staffing or systems of a major urban hospital. Intake forms were completed by people working under pressure, with incomplete information, in circumstances that did not allow for the kind of precision that the situation deserved. The form created for her had carried not her name, but a working name given to her by the driver who found her. He had found 2 injured passengers near each other and had named them both on the ambulance paperwork, because unnamed patients caused delays and he had been trying to be helpful. The name had nothing to do with her. It was not her name and bore no resemblance to it, but it was what the intake form said, and the intake form went into the system. When she woke and gave her real name, a note was added to her file. But the original name remained the primary record. It was the name that appeared when her record was pulled up. When the hospital attempted to notify her family, the contact was made under the name on the record. It reached another family entirely. Her actual family received no notification. And the casualty list, that single-typed document that had been circulated through official channels and family groups and had reached Adebayo on a Tuesday afternoon, had been compiled from records across multiple facilities under significant pressure from officials, journalists, and families demanding information. Her name appeared on it because a record with her approximate age, her approximate injury profile, and the wrong name had been matched to a similar entry in another file by a tired official trying to account for everyone. The match was imprecise. The official had no way of knowing this. They were doing their job with what was available to them. Nobody had acted out of cruelty. Nobody had been indifferent on purpose. It was an accumulation of individually understandable failures, each one small enough to seem correctable, together amounting to something that had taken her name and placed it on a list of the dead and sealed her into an absence she had not chosen. She did not know any of this while it was happening. She knew only what the fog and then the gradual clearing of it allowed her to know, that she was in a hospital, that she was being cared for, that she had a family somewhere, and that no one from that family had come. She was moved to a rehabilitation facility after her acute medical care was complete. It was a quieter place, outside the city, focused on recovery rather than treatment. She shared a room with a woman named Margaret, who had suffered a stroke and was also doing the slow work of learning to inhabit her body and her mind again in ways she had not had to learn since childhood. They did not talk much. There is a kind of companionable silence between people who are both doing very difficult interior work in the same space, and they had that silence between them, and Amara found it better than the alternative. Her phone had been destroyed in the accident. She had no way to reach anyone directly. The facility had a shared telephone, but calls required a logging process and approval, and in her early weeks there she was not well enough to navigate the procedure. By the time she was well enough to navigate it, something had happened that changed the shape of what the phone call would have to be. Margaret's family brought newspapers when they visited. One afternoon, Amara was searching through a pile of them for a specific article someone had mentioned, and she found the casualty list on a middle page of a paper from several weeks earlier. She had not been looking for it. It was simply there. She read it. She found her own name. She set the paper down on her lap and sat very still, with the room quiet around her, and understood what it meant. Her family had been told she was dead. They had held a funeral. They had grieved. And she made the choice. She would spend 3 years living inside. She told Adebayo this directly. She did not soften it or reframe it as something other than a choice. She had been injured and frightened and not yet fully herself, but she had been capable of making decisions by that point, and this was a decision she had made. She was afraid of going back. Not afraid of the world outside, not afraid of recovery, not afraid of the ordinary difficulties of returning to a life that had been interrupted, afraid of what it would cost her family to have the grief reversed. Grief is not simply sadness. It is an enormous amount of work, the specific labor of reorganizing a life around an absence, of accepting the shape of things without the person who is gone, of building a new ordinary around the loss. Her family had done this work. Her mother had stood at a grave and said goodbye and gone home, and made a room ordinary again, and found a way to keep living. To arrive at that door and say, the grave was wrong, the list was wrong, start over, it felt, to a person still not entirely herself, like asking them to do the worst thing twice. She knew, even then, that this reasoning was not entirely rational. She said this to Adebayo clearly. She did not ask him to agree with the reasoning or to validate it. She said, this is what she had thought, and she had been injured, and when a person is injured and isolated and fragile, their thoughts do not always take the paths they would take in full health. They take the paths of least immediate damage, even when those paths lead somewhere that causes more damage eventually. She told herself she would go back when she was ready. She told herself this in the rehabilitation facility, and then in the small rented room she found in Accra after discharge, and then for another year, and then for another year after that. She found work through a catering company. She found a life that was small and functional and largely invisible. She told herself, every few months, that she was nearly ready, that the right moment was nearly there. She told herself this with diminishing conviction, and continued doing it anyway, because the alternative, making the call, knocking on the door, confronting the scale of what the silence had grown into, was something she could always find a reason to postpone by one more week. The silence compounded. This is what certain silences do. They accumulate weight, and the weight makes breaking them feel harder than it is, even when breaking them requires only one phone call, one sentence said aloud, one hand raised to knock on a gate. She had known for most of the 3 years that she was wrong. She had carried that knowledge alongside everything else she was carrying and found ways to set it aside, until a man in a formal jacket had looked up from a soup bowl in a government dining room and the setting aside had come to an end. She said all of this to Adebayo plainly. She did not ask him to forgive it in the moment. She asked him to understand it accurately, which was a different and more honest request. He listened to all of it without interrupting. He gave her the whole of her account before he spoke. When she stopped, the night around them was quiet. The car park was empty. The city hummed at its normal distance. Somewhere above the wall, a palm tree moved in a light wind. "Your mother," he said. Amara's face changed completely. "I know," she said. "She buried you. She stood at your grave." He stopped. He did not honestly know what Grace Diallo had done with the 3 years. He had let that contact go. He had stayed away because approaching it meant approaching Amara, and approaching Amara had meant the weight. He was not proud of this. He acknowledged it to himself without making a statement of it. "I know," she said again. The word was different this time, not explanatory, settled. "You have to go home," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. Something moved between them in the space of that look. It was not quite forgiveness, and it was not the absence of forgiveness either. It was something older and more fundamental. Two people who had known each other for 15 years, standing in the dark outside a government building, being honest with each other in the way that only very old and very specific friendships allow. "Will you come with me?" she asked. He had not been prepared for the question. The answer was there before she finished asking it. "Yes," he said, "I will come." She looked at the ground for a moment, then back at him. "I missed you," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I know you did," he said. They stood there a little longer. The warm Accra night continued around them, indifferent and ordinary, carrying on the way the world always carries on, regardless of what is happening in the lives of the people it contains. He looked at her and he thought about a voice note she had sent him 4 years ago in which she had reviewed the food at a government function with the seriousness of a professional critic. He thought about a Wednesday in January when pressing a small button had felt irreversible. He thought about a corner of a room with a glass of juice, and the specific moment when a water glass was refilled across the table and he had looked up, reflexively, without thinking about it, without having any reason to. He thought, "I almost did not come to this banquet." He thought, "I almost did not look up." "Let us go," he said. She asked him then, and it was the first question she had asked him that was not about herself, not about the past, what it had been like, the 3 years, for him. He thought about how to answer. He was not a person who talked about himself easily, which she had always known and had occasionally tried to change by asking him questions that required more than a one-word answer. He thought about the gray weeks and the way his flat had felt in the months after, too quiet, in a way it had not felt quiet before. He thought about the way he had continued working and continued going home and continued eating and had found, gradually, that he was managing, which was its own kind of achievement when managing is the best available option. He told her some of it, not all of it. He told her about the January Wednesday honestly. He told her about the voice notes, which he had not told anyone about, which he had barely admitted to himself. He said, "I kept them. I did not listen to them. I am not entirely certain why I kept them." She was quiet for a moment after this. "I think I know why," she said. "I think you probably do," he said. She looked at the wall beside them, the low wall in whose shadow they had been standing for the better part of an hour, and then back at him. "I used to wonder," she said, "what you would have said, on the phone, if I had called. In those first months, I went through it in my head many times. What I would say, what you would say. I had whole conversations in my head with you, about everything and about nothing, the way we always did. I used to have them, and then put them away, and tell myself I would have them properly, soon, when I called. He looked at her. I had conversations with you too, he said, in the opposite direction. He paused. That is a strange thing to admit. It is not strange, she said. It is what people do when they lose someone they talk to every week for 15 years. You are not lost, he said. No, she said. I am not. They stood in the warm dark for another moment. We should go, he said. Yes, she said. We should go. They left Accra before the city properly woke. Adebayo had gone back to the hotel, collected his overnight bag, settled the bill with a receptionist operating on the final careful reserves of a very long shift, and driven back to the street outside Amara's building. She was on the pavement with a small bag already over her shoulder. She put it in the back seat without ceremony and got in the front. He started the engine. The radio came on and he turned it off. They pulled out into the pre-dawn streets. Accra at that hour was a different city from the one it became by 8 in the morning. The roads were nearly empty, the traffic lights cycling through their sequences for almost no one, the pavements bare except for the occasional early vendor setting up a stall or the occasional walker moving with purpose towards something that could not wait for sunrise. The city had a temporary held quality, as though it was pausing before the day insisted on beginning. He drove through it, and the quiet in the car matched the quiet outside, and neither of them felt the need to change it. She fell asleep an hour into the drive. She slept in the passenger seat with her head tipped slightly toward the window, very still, in the way she had always slept, as though even unconscious she was being careful about how much space she was taking up, about not imposing on the air around her. He had not remembered this about her. He found that he had forgotten many small specific things in 3 years, and was now remembering them one by one in a way that was strange and not entirely comfortable, because each remembered thing was evidence of the gap, evidence of the years of not remembering that had preceded this morning. He drove and she slept, and the sky lightened gradually. It went from black to the deep blue that comes before dawn, then to a lighter and more uncertain gray, then to the first hesitant orange at the horizon that becomes, within minutes, full morning. By the time she woke, the day was fully arrived. She opened her eyes, looked at the road ahead, and sat up. How long? She asked. 2 hours. I am sorry. Do not be. She looked at the road for a while without speaking. The morning light was the direct, unforgiving kind that arrives when you have not slept properly and makes everything look more real than you are ready for. She pushed her hair back from her face and settled in her seat. I thought about what you would say, she said, after a while, when I let myself imagine telling someone, telling anyone. You were always the person I imagined telling first. He kept his eyes on the road. Then why did you not? He asked. Not with sharpness. The question was a real one, and he asked it that way. She thought about her answer before giving it. Because telling you made it real, made it concrete, what I had done. As long as no one in my life knew, I could still believe I was only waiting for the right moment that was coming, that would arrive, that would make the telling easier somehow. She paused. The right moment never came, but I could keep believing it would. Telling you would have ended that. That does not make rational sense, he said. No, she agreed. And I understand it completely, he said. She turned to look at him. He did not turn from the road. A small amount, he said. That is how angry I am. I want to be precise. She exhaled. He could hear something releasing in the sound of it. I deleted your contact from my phone, he said. In January, 3 years ago, on a Wednesday evening when nothing particular was happening, I sat on the kitchen floor afterward for a long time, which I had not anticipated. She was quiet for a moment. I am sorry, she said, simply. Without apology for the apology, without softening or explaining or qualifying, just the words, plainly. I know, he said. They did not speak for a while after that. The road went on ahead of them, through the towns and the dry-season trees and the stretches of open farmland. He found he was not uncomfortable with the silence. It was a different kind of silence from any they had shared before. Not the easy silence of two people who have known each other long enough not to need constant conversation, and not an uncomfortable silence either. It was the silence of two people doing something new and not yet knowing exactly what kind of silence it required. They stopped at a roadside shop outside Suhum. He filled the tank. Amara got out and went to the shop and came back with 2 bottles of water and a small bag of groundnuts. She poured some into his palm without asking whether he wanted them. He ate them slowly, one at a time, and found that he was, despite everything, despite the hours behind them and the hours ahead, and the largeness of what the morning was moving toward, glad of the morning, quietly and genuinely glad of it. The road continued. The towns came and went. Amara grew quieter as the kilometers reduced between them and Kumasi. He noticed it happening by degrees, the way you notice a shift in weather, not in a single moment but in accumulation. Her hands were on her knees, her fingers pressed together and released and pressed again in a rhythm she was not conscious of. "She will be angry," she said. He did not pretend not to know who she meant. "Yes," he said. "She will cry, not immediately after. Probably. Then angry again, and then tired, and then all 3 things at once, most likely." She paused. "I know her. I know how she processes things." "You know her well," he agreed. "I know her well, and I have given her 3 years of very good reasons to be angry," Amara said. She said it plainly, without self-pity, which was the honest way to say it. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Is she well? In herself? Do you know?" "I do not know," he said. "I lost contact with the family. In the months after. I am not defending that. I stayed away because thinking about your family meant thinking about you, and thinking about you was very large. I know that is not an adequate explanation." "It is an honest one," she said. "I should have been better," he said. "I know that." She did not offer him reassurance on this point, and he did not expect her to. He had said the true thing, and she had received it, and they left it there. Kumasi arrived around them gradually. The landscape changed from the open country of the road to the edges of a city. Houses first, then petrol stations, then the denser arrangement of buildings that meant they were close. He knew every road here. He had known them since he was a child. He watched Amara watching the city through the window with an expression he had not seen before on her face. The specific look of a person returning to something she had told herself was permanently in the past and finding it still present, finding it exactly as it was when she left it. He turned onto her mother's street. "Stop here," she said. They were 30 meters from the gate. He stopped the car and cut the engine. The house was visible through the windscreen. The gate was the same gate. The tree in the compound had grown noticeably, taller now and fuller, the top branches visible above the wall. There was laundry on the line inside the compound. Someone was home. Someone was always home. He had known Grace Diallo when Amara had still been alive, and Grace had been a woman who was always in her house, always present, a constant. Amara sat looking at the gate. He sat and let her look. She sat for a long time, long enough that the laundry shifted once in the wind and a motorcycle went past at the end of the street, long enough that the morning heat, which had been building steadily as the sun climbed, became noticeable inside the car with the engine off. "Will you wait?" she asked. "As long as you need," he said. She picked up her bag from the back seat. She held it in her lap for a moment. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said, "for attending the banquet, for looking up." He said nothing. He watched her open the door, step out onto the pavement in the morning light. She stood for a moment with her bag over her shoulder, facing the gate. From where he sat, he could see in the set of her shoulders that she was breathing carefully, the deliberate, measured breathing of a person who is about to do the thing they have been postponing for 3 years and who cannot postpone it any further. She walked to the gate. She knocked. A minute passed, then the gate opened from inside, and a woman was standing in the gap. He could not see the face clearly from 30 meters away. He did not need to. He knew whose it was. He watched the woman in the gate go completely still. He watched Amara speak. He could not hear the words. He watched the woman's hands come up. He watched her step forward. He watched Amara catch her. They stood together in the gateway, holding on. He turned off the air, which had already been off, and he simply sat. He had said he would wait as long as it took. He had meant it. He had nowhere else he needed to be, and nothing else he needed to do, and he sat with his hands resting on the wheel, and he waited. The morning continued around him. A child passed on the pavement with a school bag, paying no attention to the parked car. A dog crossed the road at the far end of the street at a slow, purposeful trot. The laundry moved on the line inside the wall. The sun climbed. He sat and thought about nothing in particular, which is what a person does when they have been thinking about something very large for a long time and have arrived at the other side of it and need to simply rest inside the ordinary world for a while. He sat. The street was quiet. The gate was still. He was not going anywhere. He sat in the car and let himself think about what had just happened, which he had not done in the hours since the dining hall, because there had not been time and now there was. He had walked into a government kitchen and found a person who had been buried. He had said he would drive her to Kumasi and she had agreed. He had sat in a hotel lobby at midnight, filling out a checkout form, and then driven a borrowed car through a sleeping city to a pavement in Accra. And now he was in a borrowed car on a Kumasi street with his hands on the wheel and the sun climbing and the laundry moving on the line inside the compound of the house that Grace Diallo had lived in for 30 years. And none of it was a thing he had planned to do a week ago, or a month ago, or at any point before the soft clink of a water glass had reached him across a formal dining room and his hand had looked up before his mind had finished thinking about whether to. He thought about what Peter would say when he told him. Peter would say something predictably optimistic that would be, accidentally, exactly right. He thought about Colin, who would raise both eyebrows and then nod slowly, because Colin processed surprising information by raising his eyebrows and then accepting it, which was a reasonable approach. He thought about how much of this he would tell anyone, and decided that the answer was very little. Some things were not stories for offices or for the particular kind of conversation that happens over lunch. Some things were the private property of the people they had happened to and belonged only to them. A figure appeared at the corner of the compound wall, Amara, coming around the side of the gate, not through it. She walked toward the car, and he saw from the way she was walking, slightly slower than her usual pace, heavier in her steps, that she had been crying. She was not crying now. She had the dry-eyed and slightly raw look of someone who has finished. She opened the passenger door and got in. He did not ask how it went. He waited. She sat in the seat and looked straight ahead through the windscreen. She held me, she said, for a long time, and then she brought me inside, and then she asked me where I had been. Yes, he said. She is. She stopped. She pressed her hands together in her lap. She is exactly as I knew she would be, angry and relieved and exhausted, all at once. Yes, he said. She told me I looked thinner. He almost smiled. He did not. This was not the moment for it. And then she told me to sit down, and she made tea, Amara said, which is the most like her thing she could have done. Which is the most like her thing anyone could have done in any situation. She paused. I had forgotten that she does that. I had forgotten how much it matters. He sat with this. You should go back in, he said. I will go. She looked at him. You do not have to go, she said. You need today, he said. You do not need me here for it. I will go home. I will call you tomorrow. She looked at him for a moment longer. Tomorrow, she agreed. She got out of the car. She stood on the pavement for a moment, and then she walked back to the gate, and she let herself in without knocking this time, which meant she had been given the right to let herself in, and that was the first of many small ordinary things that would be returned to her over the coming weeks. He started the car. He drove home through the familiar Kumasi streets, and he was tired in the particular and not entirely unpleasant way of a person at the end of a night and a morning in which something very large has happened, and he drove home, and he went inside, and he slept for 4 hours, and woke up in the late afternoon to a Kumasi that was exactly as it had always been and entirely different, and he sat in his kitchen and made tea, because making tea was what people did. The reunion was not a film. He was careful to say this when people asked him about it later, and people did ask, because word moved the way it always moves, through family first, then through neighbors, then through the wider community, carried by people who had known Amara and by people who had only heard about her, and eventually reaching people who had never known she existed and who found the story remarkable in the way that people find remarkable any story in which something believed to be lost turns out still to be there. A journalist from a local publication sent a politely worded request asking whether anyone would agree to speak with her. The family declined and asked for privacy and received enough of it. But the story moved anyway, as stories do, and Adebayo was asked about it by people who knew him well enough to ask directly, and who expected a word like wonderful. He understood why they expected it. He could not give it to them in good conscience. Real was the word he kept returning to when he thought about it. It was entirely, and sometimes painfully, and sometimes gratefully, and sometimes strangely, real. Grace Diallo brought her daughter inside and sat her down in the front room. The front room of that house was exactly as Adebayo remembered it from the many times he had visited over the years. The same furniture arranged in the same way, the same particular quality of light coming through the curtains, the same low sound of the street outside. Grace sat down across from her daughter and she looked at her. She looked at her for a long time, in silence, in the way a person looks when they need to confirm something again and again because their eyes keep not quite reconciling what they are being shown with what they know to be true. She looked until she was certain. Then she asked, very quietly, where Amara had been. She asked it in the voice she had developed over the years of her life that required it, steady and low, and containing more than it expressed, the voice of a woman who had learned not to raise it, because raising it did not accomplish what the other kind of speaking could. Amara told her everything. The accident, the hospital room she had woken in, the weeks of fog and confusion, the rehabilitation facility, the clerical chain of failures that had placed her name in the wrong place in an official document, the choice, wrong, fearful, made by a person who was still not entirely herself, to stay quiet rather than return. She told it from the beginning to the present, and she looked at her mother while she told it, and she did not soften any of the parts that did not reflect well on her. Grace listened. When Amara was finished, Grace sat back in her chair. She looked at her daughter for a moment. She said, I buried you. Amara said, I know. I stood at your grave. I put flowers in the ground. I went home afterward, and I made your room ordinary again, because I could not live with it preserved, because looking at a preserved room is the worst kind of keeping. I know, Mama. Grace sat with this for a moment. Then she said, I am very glad you are not dead, and I am very angry with you. Both of these things are completely true at the same time, and I am not going to choose between them or pretend that one makes the other smaller. You need to understand that. Amara said she understood. She did understand. That was the particular nature of it. The understanding itself had its own weight. There was no villain in the story Grace had just been handed. There was no single person who had acted with cruelty or indifference. There was an accumulation of small institutional failures, followed by one large personal one, and at the end of all of it, 3 years of a woman doing the slow daily labor of continuing to live after the worst things she had been told. That labor did not stop costing what it cost just because the reason for it turned out to have been wrong. You cannot undo grief that has been done. You can only show up for what comes after. Grace was not cruel. She was not capable of cruelty toward her own daughter, and Amara had always known this. But she was honest, and she was exhausted in the way that 3 years of grief had built into her, and in the weeks that followed she moved between the relief of having Amara back and the specific anger of having been made to do unnecessary work, the work of loss, the work of grief, the work of reorganizing an entire life and an entire heart around an absence that turned out to be wrong, and she made no effort to pretend that one feeling canceled the other. She had earned both, and she held both, and Amara did not ask her to put either of them down. Amara came to the house every day. She sat with whatever the day required. She brought food sometimes, made tea, did the dishes, sat at the kitchen table in the chair she had always preferred, and she was simply present in whatever way the morning or the afternoon needed. She did not ask for a faster forgiveness than the one that was available. She did not ask for recognition for showing up. She showed up because it was the right thing, and because it was all she had that she could offer without conditions. Her brother Simon, now 24 and working for an engineering company on the other side of the city, cried when he first saw her. He cried openly, without warning, in the way that younger siblings sometimes do when they have been trying very hard not to be the one who fell apart. He was immediately embarrassed about the crying and made a joke to cover the embarrassment, the kind of joke that lands softly because it is not quite good enough to land any other way, and Amara laughed at it genuinely. Not to spare him, but because it was exactly the kind of joke Simon had always made, and she had not heard one in 3 years, and the familiarity of it, the specific Simonness of it, was funny to her in a way she had not expected to feel funny about anything for a while. Her older sister Clara was more careful. Clara was the person in the family who processed before she felt, who needed to understand the full shape of something before she could decide what to do with it emotionally. She was also the one who had managed the practical aftermath of Amara's death, the paperwork, the official requests, the administrative weight that falls to the oldest child when the parent is too devastated to carry anything with a deadline. She looked at Amara with assessing eyes in those first days. Not cold, Clara was not cold, but measuring. She needed time, and Amara gave it to her without asking for anything in return, because she could not ask for a welcome she had not yet earned, and she knew it, and she respected Clara enough to know that Clara would arrive at her own feeling in her own time, and that the arrival would be real when it came. It came, eventually, slowly, and then all at once, in the way of things that have been held back for a while, and then release. The process of officially being alive again took longer than it should have. 3 years was time enough for the records to be thoroughly settled, and correcting them required evidence and visits to offices and interactions with bureaucrats who had never encountered this particular situation before, and were not certain which procedure was applicable. At one government office, a junior clerk looked at his screen and told Amara with genuine uncertainty that the system showed her as deceased, and he would need supporting documentation from her to the contrary. She said, "I am standing in front of you." He said he understood, but the process still required the paperwork. She told Adebayo about this later, at the cafe near the Central Market, and he laughed at it for a long time, genuinely and without trying to stop, and she laughed with him, and the laughter made it smaller than it had been, which is what laughter does when it can be found. Adebayo went with her to 3 of the 5 necessary office visits. He knew the forms and the procedures. He knew which supervisors to contact by name and which forms had routes through the system that were faster than others. 9 years in public administration had given him a detailed and practical knowledge of where bureaucracies had hinges that could be used if you knew where they were. She told him he did not have to come. He said he was aware of that and came anyway. She found a flat in Kumasi. Small, completely hers, the kind of space that returns you to yourself at the end of each day because it contains only what you have chosen to put in it and nothing that belonged to anyone else. She needed this. She applied to a financial services company and was hired after 2 interviews. The work was real and used the education she had and required her to think rather than simply to move, and she was good at it. She had known she would be good at it. She had spent 3 years doing work that asked less of her than she had available, and returning to her actual level was like standing at full height after a long time crouching. Her body knew immediately that this was correct. Adebayo saw her most weekends. They met at the place near the Central Market, a spot she had found in her first week back in Kumasi, a small restaurant with excellent food and music that played at a volume slightly above what was ideal for conversation. By the time they noticed it, They had been talking for 2 hours, and the conversation was more important than the noise. They talked the way they always had, about everything, and about ordinary things, about their weeks, and about the country, and about books, and about colleagues, and about whatever was happening in the world that week that was worth commenting on. They argued about things that did not matter. They agreed about things that did. The friendship resumed itself around the gap the years had left, the way a plant grows back around a wound in its bark, changed by it and marked by it but still itself, still growing. He told her one Saturday morning, over coffee, that he still had the voice notes. She went still. She looked out the window of the cafe for a moment. "Delete them," she said. "I know," he said. He did not delete them that day. He deleted them some weeks later on an unremarkable evening, and he put his phone down afterward and did not sit on the kitchen floor. He made tea. He felt something that was not grief and was not relief, but was in the area of both, the specific feeling of a person releasing something they no longer need to carry because the reason for carrying it has changed. 6 months after the night of the banquet, on a Thursday morning while he was working through a correspondence backlog at his desk, his phone rang. A Kumasi landline he did not have saved. He answered. "Adebayo," said Grace Diallo. He had not spoken to her since the morning of the car, the street, the gate. "Grace," he said, "I want to thank you." He said, "You do not have to." She said, "I know I do not have to. That is exactly why I am doing it." He sat with that for a moment before he responded. "How are you?" he asked. She was quiet briefly before answering. "Better," she said. "Most days I am better. Some days it is still strange. I will look at her and there will be a moment, only a moment, very quick, where I think, but she is supposed to be gone, and then she looks back at me, and I remember that she is not." A pause. It is a strange thing to have to keep remembering, but it is a much better kind of strange than the one I had before. "Yes," he said. "I imagine it is." "She told me you waited in the car," Grace said, "that morning, that you sat out in the street and did not leave." "I was not going to leave," he said. A short silence. "She is very lucky to have a friend who waits," Grace said. He sat with that. "I am also lucky," he said. He meant it without qualification or performance. It was a fact he had thought about in the months since the banquet, turned over carefully, and arrived at with confidence. The call continued for a few minutes. Ordinary things, questions about each other's families, the small news that people share when they have re-established contact after a gap. When it ended and he set the phone down, he sat for a moment at his desk with his hands resting on the papers in front of him and his gaze somewhere beyond the window. He thought about a Thursday in October 3 years ago and everything that came after it, the gray weeks, the borrowed jacket at a graveside, the Wednesday in January and the kitchen floor, the long and populated middle ground between happiness and unhappiness where he had lived and built a reasonable life and been, on balance, all right. He thought about a banquet invitation placed face down on his desk, about a colleague named Peter with great confidence about government food, about a stiff jacket worn for the 3rd time to an event he had almost declined to attend. He thought about a dining hall and a crystal chandelier and 40 people and the soft clink of a water glass being refilled at the far end of a table. He thought about a hand at a collarbone. He thought, "I almost did not go." He thought, "I almost did not look up." He picked up his phone and called Amara. It was Thursday morning. He did not think about the fact that it was Thursday. He simply called. She answered on the second ring. "Yes?" Office noise behind her. She was in the middle of something. "Nothing," he said. "I only wanted to call." A short pause. "Call me later," she said. And she laughed, briefly, warmly, the small particular laugh he had known for 15 years, and then not heard for 3, and then heard again in a government kitchen in Accra at 11 o'clock at night, while the world had been quietly putting itself back together around both of them. The same laugh. Entirely hers, entirely real. "I will," he said. He hung up. Outside the window, Kumasi went on. The traffic and the trees and the ordinary city, full of people living ordinary lives that were seconds away at any moment from becoming something else entirely, and full of all the moments that came just after, the quiet ones, the unhurried ones, the ones that do not announce themselves as significant and turn out to be the ones that a person carries forward for the rest of their life. He turned back to his desk. He had work to do, and he did it, and the day was good. He thought, sometimes, in the months that followed, about the specific texture of the 3 years he had spent not knowing. Not the grief itself, which he had processed as best he could, and which had become something he carried well enough. The texture of not knowing, the particular quality of a loss that does not leave a space, but simply seals over, like a door that has been wallpapered over, so that you can no longer see where it was, can barely remember it was there, but is still there behind the wall. He had not known she was alive. That was the simple fact. He had not known, and the not knowing had shaped 3 years of his life in ways he was only now beginning to trace. The things he had not said because there was no one he wanted to say them to the same way. The phone he had not reached for on evenings when he would otherwise have reached for it. The voice notes he had saved without listening to, because listening would have required something he did not have available. He had built a good life in those 3 years. He was honest about this. It was not a life constructed around grief or absence. It was a real life, with real work and real friendships and real satisfactions, and real ordinary problems that needed solving. He was not a person who had been waiting. He had simply been living. The loss had shaped the living without determining it. But now she was there. And the loss was not a loss. And the life he had built was still there, but the shape of it had changed, not dramatically but specifically, in the way that things change when one important component that was missing turns out to be recoverable. He told her none of this directly. This was not the kind of thing he said directly, but she knew. She had always known the things he did not say, which was one of the foundational properties of their friendship, and he had always known the things she did not say, and neither of them had ever felt the need to announce this. It was simply true. On a Saturday afternoon in the 3rd month after her return, they drove out to a spot on the edge of the city where there was a view of the valley that was worth stopping for, a place he had gone to occasionally over the years when he needed to think about something that required space around it. They sat in the car with the windows down and the afternoon light falling across the valley, and they talked, and they did not talk, in the proportions the afternoon required. At one point she said, looking at the valley rather than at him, "I am going to be here for a long time." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "you are." She nodded once, as though confirming something she had already decided. He looked at the valley. The light was the particular gold of late afternoon, the kind that makes a landscape look more certain of itself than it does at any other hour, as though the land knows exactly what it is and does not need anyone to tell it. He thought about all the things that had almost been different. An invitation not taken, a banquet not attended, a glass of water not refilled at precisely that moment, a head not turned. He thought, this is what it is to live in a world where things can go either way, where the difference between 3 more years and this afternoon is a reflex. He was not, he understood, a person who had been saved by luck, exactly. He was a person who had been present at the right moment when luck arrived, which was different. You could not arrange the luck. You could only arrange to be present. He had been present. At a banquet he had almost not attended. In a dining hall he had almost left early. At a window at the end of a corridor he had almost walked past. The afternoon light moved across the valley. The city hummed at its regular distance. Amara said something about the view, and he said something back, and they sat there for another hour before driving home through the streets of the city that had been his city his entire life and was still his city and was now, again, hers. He dropped her at her flat. She got out and said she would call him tomorrow. He said he would answer. She said, obviously, and she shut the door and walked toward her building without looking back, the way a person does when they are comfortable in the place they are going, when returning is easy and ordinary and does not require looking back to check that it is real. He drove home. He parked the car. He went inside and made tea, and sat at the kitchen table with the evening settling around him. And he thought, I went to a banquet. I looked up when a glass was refilled. I pushed through a door. That was all. And that was everything.